Here we go! Germany finally invaded France on May 10th, 1940. This was the epic rematch that the world has been waiting for since World War I 20 years ago. Germany, however, brought a knife to this fistfight, or rather, a goddamn sickle. Operation Sickle Cut meant that Germany could, in theory, slice up the soft French underbelly as long as they could sneak through the hazardous Ardennes forest. Unlike World War I and its stagnant, endless hell of trench warfare, this was a high-risk, high-return gamble, and things weren't looking good to begin with. The gigantic death ball of Germany's armed brigade got tangled up with each other and was completely stuck in the middle of the Ardennes. If the French surrounded them here, then shit. That's GG right there. The only option was to slowly crawl forward, praying to sweet Jesus that French would just sit on their ass. Hold on, is everything actually all quiet on the Western Front? France actually was sitting on its ass while Germany anxiously advanced through the forest. Remember, the biggest objection for this 400 IQ plan was, how could you possibly stealth a bunch of tanks through a cancer forest? And they just did it. The Germans were now able to encircle and eviscerate the main French army. How is this even possible? Ironically, post-war arrogance did the French in. You see, the commander-in-chief of the French armed forces was a man named Maurice Gamelin, an absolute war hero back in World War I. Well, he got a bit too cocky and complacent over the past 20 years and refused to adapt to the brave new world. The French were simply not prepared for this kind of war. His whole strategy depended on defend first, then counterattack, which is why they focused all their efforts on making France as tanky as humanly possible. Maurice expected the Nazis to charge through the Maginot Line for an epic showdown and fight like gentlemen. And the Nazis were not gentlemen. Yeah, I really don't know why Maurice expected Hitler's army to fight fair and square. The Nazis going around the Maginot Line and invading through the Ardennes forest never even crossed his mind. And it's not like he wasn't warned about it either. Maurice just ignored the French intelligence, hysterically screaming that the Germans were coming from the trees, assuming it was just disinformation or whatever. Here we go, World War II, and the French just threw away their overwhelming defenders' advantage. Fine, they had a rough start, but that doesn't mean it's game over yet for the French. As swarms of German tanks poured out of the Ardennes forest, the French picked themselves up and tried to get their shit together. But it's just too little, too late. For starters, the French military doctrine was outdated and now pretty useless. I mean, we all saw how the Germans used bombers and tanks in Poland, right? A competent commander may have, tried to adapt to this new meta of war, but not Maurice. As far as he was concerned, the French military won World War I, the war to end all wars, so why fix what isn't broken? Final nail in the coffin? The French military was running on Windows XP, while the Nazis had Windows 11. The Germans traditionally had a decentralized operating system called Mission Command, which means that commanders would just give a generic mission to their subordinates and let them figure out the best way to achieve it on the spot. But back in the trench warfare stalemate hell of World War I, there really weren't any commands to give other than open fire, halt, or charge, so this OS wasn't particularly overpowered in that meta, yeah? Well, the devs patched that shit up in the World War II update and completely changed the game. Now, things were always changing. The game was running at an unbelievably fast pace, and the traditional German way of war suddenly became game-breakingly overpowered. The Germans found conviction in their methods during the invasion of Poland and leaned into it, equipping every single tank with a radio, opening up communications with jets in the sky, and starting what we consider modern combined armed warfare. And don't get me wrong, this is really difficult to pull off, but the German military was in peak condition. The Treaty of Versailles meant that the German military was capped at 100,000, and these 100K were the brightest and most elite officers that the Germanic people had to offer. They even had first-hand battle experience during the invasion of Poland and Norway, so, of course, They knew their shit very well and were great at improvising. France, on the other hand, none of that. It just stuck to its outdated, romantic World War I method of war. For every single mission, you had to report to the superiors, wait for a command, and then finally execute it. Might not sound too bad in theory, but they didn't have radios. Some dude had to get on a motorcycle to get to Central Command, which might take as long as 2 days. The French had a bloated, antiquated, useless military that was no match for the Nazis. The final challenge that lay between the Nazis and the heart of France was the Meuse River. The armored fist of the Nazi forces punched its way through the panicked, confused, scattered French opponents and arrived in Sedan, a key city along the Meuse River. Guderian's unstoppable tanks just steamrolled through while being covered by the Luftwaffe, bombing the shit out of whatever feeble resistance the French managed to throw up. Sedan was lost, just like that, and the French had no chance but to destroy all the bridges in hopes of slowing down the Nazi rampage. The Nazi brigades then started to independently raid all the cities along the Meuse simultaneously, and this is when the world realized how overpowered the mission command system truly was. The military genius of tank warfare that will later be known as the legendary Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, steps up to claim his place in history. The bridges were destroyed, yes, but that wasn't enough to faze the Desert Fox. He personally scouted the area and found an island with an embankment near a village called Hu. The Germans exploited this one weak spot despite the heavy bombardment and built a bridgehead. So, this begs the question, what the hell were the French doing as the Germans were vulnerable crossing a river? Well, the primary militaries of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and even the British Expeditionary Forces were bogged down in a cancerous 4v1 against the Germans in the Netherlands. The German Combat Group B, responsible for buying time, was also a competent, significant force to be reckoned with, so this was taking way longer than it should have. To make matters worse, the fastest way to communicate was a man on a motorbike or horse, which meant that the Allies had no idea that Rommel was raiding their base on a rubber boat. Despite the Allies frantically sending everything to help out as soon as they could, it was too late, and the German tanks were already causing mayhem on this side of the river. The Nazis press the attack and sprint full speed towards the English Channel day and night, messing up their soldiers to push beyond the puny constraints of the human body. The German Blitzkrieg trampled everything in its path, with Rommel's units even advancing an astonishing 48 kilometers or 30 miles in 1 day. Hell, his tanks arrived faster than the French messengers sent to warn against them, terrifying the French to the point where his units were called the literal Ghost Division. The French stacked loss after loss, and even the sound of cannon fire in the distance was enough to send them retreating. With the German Group A slicing through France like a literal sickle, the main forces of the Allies were encircled with nowhere to run. Everything was going perfectly according to Hitler's plan. A bit too perfectly, if you ask me. Something is off here. I mean, we're talking about France here, and there's no way that France was weaker than Poland or Norway. Now, the Germans start getting suspicious at this too-good-to-be-true war, and wonder if they're walking straight into a massive trap. Hitler himself gives the order for the tank columns to halt and regroup. Coincidentally, the British just happened to succeed in a counterattack at this tiny city called Arras. Rommel's divisions were suddenly isolated and swarmed. I mean, this wasn't enough to kill off the cunning Desert Fox and his air superiority, but this close call only further reinforced the Nazi paranoia that the Allies were preparing something big. The German tanks, just moments away from a complete encirclement of the battered Allied forces, screeched to a halt at Hitler's command. This random respite from the unstoppable German rampage changed the course of history. You see, the harbor cities of northern France were already in Nazi possession. The somewhat intact British Expeditionary Forces and the French stragglers were cornered and holed up in Dunkirk, a total of 300,000 sitting ducks awaiting slaughter. They had no evac boats or Plan B. This was the very moment that the Nazis stopped attacking. The German commanders at the front were going insane, screaming that this was their chance to finish the enemy off, but for the Allies, this glitch in history was a godsend. You might have seen this part in the movie Dunkirk, but Winston Churchill approves the biggest evac mission in human history, Operation Dynamo. Boats start to flood in like a torrent from the other side of the strait, gunships, fishing boats, yachts, and even cruise ships. Hundreds of cavalry, however scrappy they may be, came to rescue the stranded soldiers out of nowhere. 300,000 Allied men were rescued that day and lived to fight another day. This miracle of an operation preserved the British Army, and Germany lost its chance to finish off the war right then and right there, all thanks to Hitler's blunder. Immediately after the evacuation mission finished, on June 4th, Hitler overcame his paranoia and ordered Dunkirk to finally fall. Now, Dunkirk was only a small fraction of French territory at the end of the day, but this was still a devastating blow to the French. The incompetent Maurice Gamelin took the fall for this disaster and was fired. His replacement, Maxim Weygand, desperately tried to stop the Nazi advance by building a line of defense around the River Somme, just like World War I. Unfortunately, even the Brits pulled out to cut their losses and defend their homeland, and the French just lost so much at this point. The Somme was overwhelmed by the Nazis in no time, and the River Aisne fell even quicker. To be fair, the Maginot Line still remained strong, but it had no way of helping the northern lines of defense from getting pummeled through. On June 14th of 1940, the capital of France, Paris, was overrun, and the Nazis practically won the war in only 6 weeks. Over 9 million refugees fled their war-torn land, while the Nazis systematically flushed out the remaining French resistance still holed up in the Alps mountain and the Maginot Line. The new Prime Minister of France, Philippe Pétain, had to make the tough call that further resistance was futile and finally surrendered. Ironically, the Nazis insisted that the French come crawling to Compiègne to sign the treaty documents, the very place that the Treaty of Versailles was signed 20 years ago. Stay tuned for the next episode of our World War II series.